Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. Very happy that Victor introduced me to his vision and invited me over. I'm going to talk about how I've been looking at creating an ecosystem in innovation from the platform that I inherited when I started Intellectual Ventures. It's a little bit different than the rainforest concepts, but there's also a lot of overlap. So I think with this notion earlier on, I believe in an earlier discussion, how having great ideas, having sex with each other can actually create better ideas. Well, I've brought my idea here to have sex with some ideas around here, and we'll see what comes out of it. Now, we can start off with a basic premise that we all agree on, which is in the 21st century, we have these huge challenges that require innovative solutions. And I've just put three up here, things like pollution and waste management, elder care, and healthcare. But there's many of them. And the good news about trying to address these challenges is that there are lots of new tools. And we've talked about a bunch of these earlier today. There's collaboration tools, there's IT, there's rapid prototyping, the ability to find inventions and innovations all over the world and bring them together, and a great access to capital. So that's good news. The thing that's tough, though, is for problems at this scale, they're incredibly complex. Okay, if you look at trying to solve the waste management problem or solve the elder care problem, this is a problem that is larger than any one company, even if it's a huge company. So the complexity is really unprecedented. This is not like trying to find just one better antenna or a little longer lasting battery. This is a huge problem that's going to involve thousands of companies somehow coordinating to solve the problem. The integration problem is huge too. There's a lot of legacy, there's a lot of legacy policy, there's a lot of incumbents that you have to deal with in pulling all of this together. And that makes motivating private enterprise very difficult because they like to be in control of the success of their product. And if they know they're just a tiny component in an overall system, they are risk adverse. They're very risk adverse to try to do something. So we know, for example, for 20-some years, people have been talking about the future of diagnostic medicine. Diagnostics are not hard to make, but if you're a diagnostic company, who's going to do the back end? Who's going to do the cell phone? Who's going to do the analytics? Who's going to actually deploy it into the healthcare system? You don't control your own destiny. Suddenly it becomes very difficult to innovate. When I started Intellectual Ventures 12 years ago, the goal was to build an ecosystem in invention, which people have pointed out is a little different than innovation. Today, we have over 20,000 inventors in our ecosystem, over 450 academic institutions. If you look at the USPTO applications, 7 out of the top 10 inventors are at IV. We've acquired over 40,000 inventions. And so we've built a big ecosystem that involves investors, over 60 investors, venture capitalists, small companies, large companies, inventors, academic institutions, and they're all over the world. We operate in 11 countries. And our inventors come from over 30 countries. So that ecosystem is a watering hole ecosystem built around invention. And all these people, whether they're investors, inventors, academic institutions, or small and large companies, have all decided to gather around that watering hole. So our next challenge was to try to figure out how do we turn invention into innovation and bring economic development benefits from this ecosystem. So a lot of people have talked about how to do this. You have to change culture, and you have to change the way governments think. Well, we started off with a slightly different premise than the rainforest premise, which is that maybe that's pretty hard to change. So let's start with an existing model and see if we can somehow retrofit a known model into something that could start that rainforest going. So the known model is what I call a mega project, or what is called a mega project. Governments do this every day. They build a dam, they build a roadway system, they build a big mixed-use complex. This schematic here is the Marina Bay Sands in Singapore. It's about a $6 billion project. Government put a lot of money into that. When you look at a project like that, there are various different stakeholders that come together to build that project. The government validates that they want a vision to be executed like this. And that gives people trust and confidence that when they go out and try to coordinate to execute that vision, they'll get paid, that actually something will happen. There are many subcontractors. This particular building involves the coordinated effort of over 10,000 companies, people who make concrete staircases, all the way to people who make works of art. And in order to bring all of those people together and to set their expectations for what needs to happen, you need an architect. You need some kind of blueprint that pulls them together. So far this sounds like very much a top-down kind of project, like the NASA space Apollo program, or programs of that kind. But I think it's an interesting template because governments know how to do this. Subcontractors know how to innovate within the bounds of the blueprint. Architects know how to design these kind of blueprints and coordinate people. So I think it's an interesting model to start off with. And now the question is, how do you make it an innovation mega project? Well, the roles are very similar. The government has to sit there and say, this is a vision that we believe in, and creates a deployment opportunity. By the government validating that vision, companies know that there really will be a deployment, that they're not going to create some new product and there's going to be no customer at the other end. That creates a demand-side stimulus that attracts innovative companies to show up. So, as an innovative company, let's say you're doing a medical diagnostic, you could do one into the kind of empty market, or you could do one as part of an innovation mega project, knowing that at least there's a set of paying customers at the other end. Those innovation companies invest their R&D because they have that security that there will be a demand at the other end, and they innovate. They build their inventions, and they productize them. To try to coordinate all of this, again, there is an architect, what we call an innovation architect, who's trying to decide how to specify the different areas where these innovation companies need to innovate, and mostly how they interact with each other. So to make sure that when there is a diagnostic company, there also is the data center that's also going to manage that diagnostics. There's also the hospital deployments that are going to happen, and there are also the policy changes that need to be coordinated to make this all work. That's the innovation architect's job. And if all of these pull together, you get a lot of innovation. Now again, this is a top-down process that normally would only create the innovations that you specified in your original blueprint. How do you make this more of a rainforest? Well, that's where this notion of platform and sockets come in. As part of the architecture, you have to define an ability for ongoing innovation to occur. So as opposed to, say, a road, where once all the concrete's laid down, it's done, or a building such as the Sands, once a building is constructed, nothing more really happens. You have to define a set of standard sockets and interfaces that allow companies to continue to innovate, continue to produce, in my earlier example, continue to produce many diagnostics, continue to produce more analytics, continue to produce new hospital services, and so on, if this was a medical case. So the notion of adding to a regular mega project, this notion of platforms and sockets, gives you an opportunity for lots of companies to innovate on top of this platform. Very much like if you think of the iOS ecosystem that Apple has built, or the Windows ecosystem that allows lots of thousands of companies to come and continue to innovate once that first thing is produced. This is a kind of platform that we think will stimulate innovation and start the rainforest going, similar to how Silicon Valley was actually started by a very big investment of microelectronics money by the US government. Assuming all of this pulls together, you find innovation companies continuously coming in and deploying their inventions, deploying their products, which leads to the collateral benefit of investment, exports, jobs, and intellectual property, which really is the part that allows you to continue to communicate and build on top of the investments that you've made. We've defined, in conjunction with the various governments, a set of early metrics for how to measure this. We are actively going out and talking to governments today, and so if you have any more questions about this, please contact me. Thank you.
Well, we're going to explore Edward's idea, but first I'm going to give you sort of 5 minutes on my background, where I'm coming from, but we're going to leave lots of time for questions and answers and advice from all of you about innovation platforms. As you heard, my background was in science and technology, all of it outside of the government except over the last year, so I really am a newcomer to being inside the government. The last 20 years was with the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, Academy of Engineering, and National Research Council for overseeing studies that are put together to give advice to the government and the public, but doing it independently of the government, trying to bring the best scientists, engineers, and other professionals to look at a wide range of issues, including a number of them done related to science, technology, and innovation. And I'll put in one plug. One of the studies that started before I retired last summer is a study on comparative innovation, which I just heard has been completed. It's going to be coming out this month, so I'm looking forward to seeing what they're providing. The committee is providing advice to the U.S., but looking at innovation policy around the world. Well, anyway, a year ago, I went to work for the Secretary of State as a science technology advisor, which has been an interesting learning experience being inside the government. The role is to try to use science for diplomacy, both science and technology for advancing diplomacy, also science technology to help solve problems that can solve some of the difficulties that countries face around the world. Also trying to use diplomacy to advance science when that's needed as well. I also try to be an advocate for more science-based policies and for all the governments, including the U.S. government that I interact with. Try to help build a capacity inside the State Department to deal with the rapidly changing scientific issues. Well, my main observation of being in this job for a year, I've talked to many countries, I've made lots of visits, and the topic that is always brought up, first of all, the highest priority in every conversation that I've had, last week it was in Latin America and Chile and Argentina and Uruguay, it's the role of science and technology to innovation and economic development. I mean, that's really the overriding issue in the minds of many countries right now. It's not only the governments, but their private sectors and their universities, how they can create an innovation-based society. You might say, why has been this transformation? Many countries, of course, realized that long ago, but now I'd say it's almost universally recognized around the world. And say, what is the reason for that? My own speculation, in part because the information and computer revolution, as we know, it's globally connected the world. Everyone understands the world is globally competitive. Every country knows they have very smart people, and they realize they're going to have to up their game in terms of turning science into innovation, into economic development, if they're going to have a chance for a prosperous future. So many countries, many governments are really thinking seriously. They're making changes in their investment policies and their support of education and research in universities, and probably the most complicated of all, trying to figure out how they build an innovation-based society where the government actually facilitates rather than it is something that stands in the way of innovation. And among the countries I've talked with, it's been in every continent. And it's not only the countries that you know already got this message long ago, the Chinas, the South Koreas, the Singapores, the India, but it's countries like in Latin America, Colombia, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam. My own prediction for if we can avoid wars and conflicts over the next decade, this could be a very optimistic time for rapid economic development around the world. And certainly I hope that's what's going to happen. In my conversations with countries, everyone's trying to figure out, well, how do we make it happen in our country? And I think most countries recognize the fundamental principles. They know they have to invest in human resources and education from grade school to the graduate school. In many cases, have to reform their educational institutions, the way they teach, so they don't turn kids off of science, engineering, and mathematics, that kids remain inquisitive throughout their lifetime. More support for students to go into these fields that can help facilitate innovation. And more support for their research universities, trying to help their research universities connect more to the private sector. Then we come to the most complicated question of all, where the devil is really in the details. What can the government do with its general policies to facilitate innovation? And of course, that deals with things related to the market, free markets, trade, foreign direct investment, intellectual property rights, tax policy, creating a climate that facilitates investment in the private sector. And the many companies that I've talked with that operate around the world, they certainly want the governments to make wise policies, but most of all, they want the government to make stable policies so they don't have to factor in, the uncertainty related to changing government policies with all the other uncertainties that they have to deal with. Probably the most difficult question to address is the government role in actually helping to fund private companies in the private sector. Every country does this. There are a wide range of approaches, some successful, some not. Many countries are very much involved in trying to facilitate startups and entrepreneurs, like the SBIR program in the United States. I learned about one called Startup Chile when I was in Chile, which I thought was quite creative. They provide $40,000 for any entrepreneur who has a company that's no more than 2 years old to come and they get a visa for a year. They have to stay for at least 6 months in Chile, but that's the only requirement. They don't have to do anything else. And they've had, it's an experiment, but it's a very interesting little experiment, I think, in trying to facilitate bringing entrepreneurs into a country. The other types of projects where the governments actually provide funding to the private sector, many of them provide funding for research and development, even for large companies, like Israel's been very successful, the startup nation in doing that. Some, of course, like the U.S. government, it provides loan guarantees and subsidies for commercial firms as well with mixed results. Many countries are involved in large infrastructure projects of all different types, some of them real estate type ventures and technology parks. Now we come to the very interesting proposal which Edward is laid out, the Innovation Mega Project. I find it interesting on 3 aspects, quite appealing, although when I say that, this is not a position of the U.S. government. I'm just giving you my personal opinion. But I'll tell you why I find it a very intriguing idea. First of all, as he indicated, the governments have actually, in the U.S., have stimulated a lot of the innovation that we live with today, and particularly the U.S. Defense Department in terms of supporting fundamental research in many fields, dual-use technologies, startup companies. Many innovations have actually come from the funding, the market, the demand-driven approach taken by the U.S. Defense Department. And that's very close to Edward's idea. The second reason is creating a platform by which innovators and companies can come in and put their own innovations and attach it to a platform or vision that's laid out by the government. Sort of the model like the iPhone with all the iPhone apps. It really created a whole ecosystem of very creative people where companies were able to make investments, conduct R&D, and actually to make a nice profit out of fitting onto this platform. The third reason why I find it appealing is I really think the future is very much connected with cities. You know, the world is undergoing a very rapid demographic transition right now. Many people, far more than half the world's population are going to be living in cities. And I believe cities really are the economic engine of many countries. In fact, what I hope we can do is to create sustainable, innovative cities for the future. And I think that cities probably are the natural connector to the Innovation Mega Project that Edward is talking about. The last thing I wanted to mention before asking Edward 3 questions, and we'll have a general Q&A. I came out of a university environment. The importance of universities to our future, I think, is absolutely key. I don't know how many of you read the New York Times this morning, but just another example of how fast things are changing. A dozen leading universities in the U.S. has joined a small startup created by 2 Stanford computer scientists to put a lot of their courseware open to the world. In all the countries I've visited, every university right now is figuring out how they can connect into this e-learning revolution that we know is going to be taking place. Another study that came out of the National Academy of Sciences that was released last June was one requested by the Congress, a bipartisan request, looking at the future of research universities in the United States. What are some of the challenges that our universities are facing? The committee that wrote the report was 1/3 industrialists and leaders of industry, university presidents 1/3, and then scientists for the other 1/3. But they made a number, I think, of hard-hitting recommendations, including the issue of universities needing to look very carefully at themselves and how they can undertake the right kind of reforms looking towards the future. Let me now turn to 3 questions for Edward. First of all, it's the interesting vision you laid out to sort of help us understand a little bit better about how it would work. Could you sort of describe some of the type of projects you think that it might be applied to, as well as some of the types of technologies? I know Intellectual Ventures has patents dealing with many innovative technologies. How does all that fit in together? What are the type of projects where you think this might actually work? And you don't have to identify any of the countries that you're talking with right now.
Well, actually, as you pointed out, cities are a big opportunity. So most of our projects are oriented around some aspect of building a better kind of city. One of the ones that has gotten pretty good traction, actually, and all of us know this no matter where we come from, is part of what's happened with the internet revolution and e-commerce is it's actually disadvantaged lots of small retail businesses. So if you go to cities nowadays and you're kind of a mom and pop store, a 2-person, 4-person micro company, and you're trying to run a corner grocery store, you're trying to run a little electronic shop, you're trying to run a book shop, pretty much you're out of luck these days. The large multinational companies or national companies with their superior logistics and supply chain management basically is wiping out those kind of businesses all over the world. So one of the things we've promoted is that cities have to build, as part of responsible cities, they should build infrastructure that allows those tiny companies to compete. That may mean a cache of warehouses that are shared amongst those things, along with logistics support and transportation support to make sure they can manage their inventory very effectively. It includes things like demographic and psychographic analysis and marketing analysis. It includes advertising space and e-advertising space. It includes all these sort of things that large companies have an advantage of right now, a Walmart has, which small companies cannot avail themselves, including purchasing power. So our belief is that in the same way that cities now provide roads and electricity and water, and that's considered just very much part of the basic infrastructure, this kind of shared infrastructure should exist from cities in a modern city to allow the health of these small, very enterprising, very tiny entrepreneur-driven companies to continue to survive. Now, the kinds of technologies that are involved in that, they can range from electric vehicles, robotics, logistics software, e-marketing software, and so on. There's a large number of what we think of as socket opportunities for lots of small companies and large companies to innovate and give these kinds of services and technologies to the large number of small companies that could be advantaged by this. So that's kind of an example. We have ones in transportation, in medical care, and elder care, and so on and so forth.
Great. Could you sort of describe for us how Intellectual Ventures has a very interesting business model? It's acquired a lot of great intellectual property. How does the Innovation Mega Project sort of fit in with your core business, and what sort of role do you envision that your company might play?
Well, it's kind of interesting. About 12 years ago, frankly, I also was a participant in one of these National Academy of Sciences. It was on the Internet Committee, in fact, and it was a great kind of learning experience to see all these incredibly smart people brought together with a single mission. And our belief was that if you could do that repeatedly with a very directed goal around invention, you could do a great job inventing or acquiring inventions, and that's essentially what we've done. But it was predicated on the notion that somehow everybody wanted invention, everyone wanted innovation. People were telling us all the time, telling it to us all the time. Turns out it's not that easy. Even if you have a lot, you have to figure out how to get it deployed. And really, this Innovation Mega Project is one of the concepts we have to try to deploy innovation at large scale. You're kind of in a funny place where if you talk about inventions that people already use, you can kind of store up thousands of them, and you can kind of sell them or license them to people, no problem. But if you talk about thousands of inventions that people don't use yet, it's very hard to get that kind of supply out into the world. So we think Innovation Mega Projects are one of these ways that you could suddenly have a tremendous pull for lots of invention, lots of innovation. And so we're thinking of several ideas like this just for our own account, because we are producing so much invention, we need to find more demand, create more demand.
Right. And then the last question, just one sentence of background. In the countries I've talked with, I've sort of come to sort of my own personal conclusions about which ones I think are probably going to be most successful in the near term. And I'll sort of give you my characteristics of those. One is that they have a real dialogue between the private sector, the universities, and the government. They really do have a coordinated approach. I was very interested this morning in the presentation about Bogota, Colombia. In fact, one of the places I visited was Medellin, Colombia. And I think both of those cities in that country have done this. They've really made progress by having this dialogue by all sectors. The other thing that I think has been very important is for the government ministries or agencies to be coordinated so they have one approach. What happens in a number of countries, there could be great policies, initiatives being taken out of one ministry, and it turns out some other ministry is doing things that are totally counterproductive. There really needs to be a mechanism for coordination inside the government. And the last criteria is the government really is very focused very much on the long term, making the investments in education and research, as well as the very near-term projects, trying to facilitate near-term innovation. So my last question in terms of Innovation Mega Projects, for Edward. What are sort of the characteristics of the governments where you think this type of approach really makes sense? What are the factors, the key ingredients? It's clearly right now not every government or country would be able to capitalize on this idea. But what is your criteria of the type of places where it really might work?
Well, you did a great job of answering the question already. So, no, frankly, it's very similar. I found it easiest to work with relatively small autonomous governments. Autonomous meaning it could be a provincial government. You can go to British Columbia or Alberta in Canada, or you can go to a province in China, for example. But they have to be relatively small and autonomous, because if you can get enough of the different ministries or different bureaucracies in a room together talking, then you can cut through a lot of stuff that gets in the way of disrupting the status quo. One of the concepts we talked a lot about yesterday here was this notion that you have to be able to disrupt the status quo. It's very hard to disrupt the status quo for a government, particularly when there are these well-defined boundaries between the different divisions of the government. You can break it down, though, if you bring them all together, and there's good leadership. That's another part of it. There has to be leadership, a desire that they're willing to break those boundaries down. And we've seen it happen. It's not common, and it has to happen quickly enough that it happens before the government changes. So that's another thing we found, is the stability of that government and its decisions is also important. But I remain, as you do, very optimistic that between just the fundamental demand for new innovation and kind of ideas like ours, or the ideas that have been discussed at this venue, I think it's very promising. We're going to see a lot of very interesting stuff happening in the future.
Great. And now we're going to turn it over to all of you for asking questions or giving advice. And this morning I sat in on a very interesting discussion. We have a delegation from Egypt that includes 18 people from all three sectors: government, universities, NGOs, and companies. They came here and making trips around the U.S. facilitated by the U.S. Agency for International Development to see what they can learn from the U.S. to take back home to a very interesting home that we read about in the newspapers every day. So I learned a lot by listening to them this morning, so now I would like to learn from all of you. So I think we have someone in the back, right, who will go with a microphone to anyone who would like to ask a question. We have one way over here, a couple.
We need the iPhone microphone app.
Right.
Android too, of course.
Hi. Let me start by saying I completely recognize the value of intellectual property and being rewarded and achieving a good outcome for the work that you do to create intellectual property as an inventor. But is there room in these innovation mega projects for open source? Because open source is a movement that's happening. It's not going to go away. It's been happening for quite a while in software. More recently, there's a lot happening in hardware and even open source biology. So what's your thoughts on the role open source can play in these innovation mega projects?
Oh, I totally believe in it. I think, having intellectual property means you can certainly give it away. And there are many cases where giving it away is exactly the right thing to do. When you're trying to establish standards or standard ways of doing things, the best way to do it is actually to give it away. So I totally believe in that. One of the things that, as you kind of implied, one of the things that's very interesting is how pervasive open source has become. If you look at the whole kind of maker subculture in hardware, where people are now able to, with computers, make all kinds of physical things. They can now open source those designs and allow other people to creatively add on to them and so on and so forth. So absolutely. I've been a big fan. I mean, actually, I was a contributor to the GNU project in several different ways, and I'm a big fan of open source. Now, that doesn't mean open source is also good for everything. So you just have to have the right balance between where you're giving things to the community for free and with open ability to modify, and where you actually want to protect the IP so that you can allow people to invest in it with security. So there's always a balance. It's a great question, though.
Hi. I really commend what you're doing. I've got a question for you with respect to what has been tried before and how the mega project is different. So real quickly, Stockholm tried to do Biotechnopolis. We're going to build a huge facility over the river, and I don't think that went anywhere. And Mission Bay actually has worked, and I won't go into why here in San Francisco or up in San Francisco, but Taiwan, Korea, and others reversed the preceptive field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. If you build it, they did not come. A lot of facilities were built, state of the art, will draw innovation, and nobody kind of wanted to go to Taiwan from here or Korea. So what is what you are doing? How does that differ from some of the state projects to date? We will build a technology center or a biotech center, and it will happen, and it doesn't. So what's going to happen with your project?
Yeah, actually, when I introduced innovation megaprojects in Singapore, it was literally in contrast to what has been done before by building up kind of a technopolis and having people show up. People know now that if you build it, they don't come. That's insufficient. And in fact, many governments, kind of their standard playbook now is, oh, well, now if we give them venture capital or we matching funds or we drop the tax rate to 0 or we give them free land, they'll come. That's totally untrue. I told them when I was at Microsoft, if we want to do something good, we might do it in a place like the Valley, which has got the highest taxes, the highest cost, and the highest land cost in the entire United States. So when you can raise taxes and people still come, that's when you know you're successful. So the concept behind innovation megaprojects is, okay, a lot of countries may not do that very well, but they actually do megaprojects pretty well. In fact, there's a lot of countries that do megaprojects better than the US does in terms of on-time delivery and under budget delivery. And what that means is that if you have lots of very innovative companies, say in the US, they are always looking for deployment opportunity, and they will move to get deployment opportunity. They may not move to get venture capital money because, as I explained to Singapore, their venture capital dollar is not worth as much as Kleiner Perkins dollar, right? But their deployment dollar, if they can get, product out and deployed, that's worth a lot. And I remember talking to, actually it was the head of a very famous multi-billion-dollar company that has actually several billion in R&D revenue. I said, we've got a lot of interesting inventions in medical technology for networking, and you have lots of vision videos on that. Why don't you do it? And he goes, well, because there's no demand yet. Because those cell phones that do that aren't there, and the sensors that do it aren't there, and the hospitals that want to do that aren't there. And I said, well, they're probably saying the same thing about the networking not being there, so what's the deal? Well, some months later, I see this same guy actually in a bar in Asia, okay? And I've never seen him outside of California before. And I said, what are you doing here? And he goes, well, they're building this huge $40 billion city project here. And I said, and what are they doing? And he goes, well, I don't know, but they're putting a lot of routers in, so I'm here. So it made me think. Well, so I told him later on, I said, well, if I could get you deployed in 20 Singaporean hospitals, would you do this medical device innovation? And he said, absolutely, absolutely, I'd do it. So what's the difference? He has R&D capital. That's not what's missing. What he sees is a buy down of his risk because there's a demand at the other end. And that allows him to move, and allows not only him to move, but the cell phone company I talked to move too. And not only them to move, but the data center company, and the guys who are doing the analytics, and so on and so forth. So somehow that promise that there's a little pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, even though it's not as large a pot of gold as the entire R&D effort, allows them to organizationally make the decision to go there. And I think we found the same thing for very, very well-funded startups, that they want revenue. At the end of the day, they will go to where the deployment is. So that's how it's different. It's a little bit of a judo flip kind of on the way organizational politics works and financing works, to say that you shouldn't put billions of dollars in on the venture side if you're a country. You should put it on the demand side, and that's what gets people motivated. You have to ask while we're asking for the next question. So, I mean, the National Academy did some really great work in bringing people together like that. Are you finding the same sort of thing happening overseas?
Well, it's one of the things I've been trying to stimulate. Every scientific organizations in almost every country right now sort of also would like to provide advice to their countries and do it where the government actually pays for the advice but doesn't control it, so they can be independent and objective and non-political. So that's occurring in many places right now. So And I personally think it's good for every country, it's good for the world if their governments do listen to the non-governmental scientific community. We know that lots of other factors besides scientific information go into decisions by public officials, but I think we're better off if public officials are at least willing to listen to the best advice from their own scientists. So I see that happening in many countries, which I think is also part of this transition and evolution that's occurring around the world. Governments paying much more attention to the role of science and technology.
This is more a commentary and observation more than a question, because it's interesting you were talking about Latin America and Startup Chile, which in my mind is the example of what not to do. $40,000 in 6 months is nothing. What people do, and I know this for a fact, they go down to Chile, they spend their $40,000, they travel around South America and go back home, because there's nothing to continue that program. Once you finish, there's no investment, there's nothing. In my experience, what's changed every region, you can trace it back to 1 or 2 success stories. Invariably. You can do it with Silicon Valley, you can do it with San Diego, you can do it everywhere. Wouldn't be a more interesting approach for these governments to selectively pick those possible 1 or 2 success stories and put all the resources there instead of a shotgun approach like these mega projects? We're talking about countries that hardly have any resources.
Yeah, well, in the case of Chile, Startup Chile is an experiment. I think probably what it may actually contribute to is not any great new innovations or large economic development, but it's actually made a lot of connections for Chile. A lot of entrepreneurs who didn't know about Chile are seeing what's happening in the country. So I think in terms of creating more knowledge about what Chile is doing, it's very useful. I guess what impressed me most about Chile when I was there was the fact that the government policies of all the ministries seem to be very well connected and working together, looking at the same goals, sort of emphasizing all the things I mentioned in terms of what a government has to do to facilitate innovation. I found the same sort of thing in the Czech Republic, in Prague. So I think some countries have certainly gotten the message. They're trying to figure out what are the projects and activities that can actually help to make it happen.
No, I think one of the challenges we'll all have in this conference is the tension between, well, I'll think of as form and function. There is a lot of form in getting entrepreneurs motivated to take their risk and go do something. Because at the end of the day, you're right, the winners are what drive the economy, but it's a very small fraction of the people who try who will become winners. So you have to have a certain number of tries, at-bats, before you're going to get a home run. And Silicon Valley gets one maybe every year or two, but has the largest number of at-bats of anywhere in the world. So it's very hard for a lot of other places to get that many at-bats. And so I think part of this whole form versus function thing is you can think about what actually makes logical, rational sense to try to advance that ball. But a lot of it just has to do with the emotional and kind of the form side of it, the emotional and I guess excitement side of trying to build up your brand so that a lot of people will come in and try. So while I would say from an economic, rational standpoint, I'm not sure giving everybody $40,000 makes a whole lot of sense. From getting up on the international stage and saying, hey, here's something you guys should get excited about, that sounds kind of interesting. Having said that, we all know that lots of government programs are subject to reverse engineering and just people taking shameless advantage of it. And that's just part and parcel of having a government program. It's bound to happen.
It's me? Is there only one mic? Okay, it's me. I haven't done an exact correlation, but what I'm seeing is that governments that have gone through liberalization, there tends to be more innovation there. As China has liberalized, Cuba just did a short one, and so I'm just wondering, that might be something interesting to study. But I did want to maybe infuse a little more tension, because I was just in Chile doing human rights with the indigenous people. And one reason it's such a great place to invest is because the government holds title to the land of the indigenous people, because they say, well, since they own it in common, no one owns it. And so, if paper industries go in and just plant their eucalyptus trees right next to the little communities and sap their water and the toxics from the paper mills. So I just hope that as people do these innovations, they really consider those type of things, and Chile having that highly repressive government for so long, people are really terrified. I mean, that city has no homeless people, no nothing. I mean, everything is pretty lockstep, right? And so just, I mean, I guess that makes an enabling environment in some ways. But, you know, just to really research, and then what's the end consequence of your product? Like right now, we need the next, you know, level of innovation around what do we do with all this radiation that's going through us with all of our gadgets and gadgets. I use a Q-Link. But, you know, if you've ever seen these, you know, to protect myself from all the radiation, it actually helps. But things like that, that just to add that into, you know, I think we can tend to think just project. Oh, I love my technology, I want to get it done, it's going to be good for humans, but also see what might be the inadvertent consequences and, you know, check out who really has title to that land. Why is it so easy to invest there? Where's your money coming from? Who's, you know, who is that blood money? And then there's just one last thing I want to say, is when we look at innovation ecosystems, I think we should also look at like drug trafficking, and I guess you said pornography industry. They're very innovative, and terrorist networks. And so maybe, you know, if we really want to see how do they stay ahead so fast, we might study them as well as Silicon Valley.
Yeah, it comes from demand. So those are great demand networks.
Good answer.
Thank you. Congratulations. One question. What is your take on the current incubator system? I come from Mexico, and we run an angel investor network. And our experience with incubators, especially the old breed of incubators, was that since they're run by government money, there's all the perverse incentives right there to actually tackle innovation, because they're looking for early stage job creation, and we're seeing a bunch of tackle stands coming up from the incubator systems, which is definitely not a good enough pipeline. And we have been helping, and there's like some people in the government that are like pushing for these new Y Combinator type of models, which are allowing for a better, in my opinion, breed of entrepreneurs. But the pitfall that we face in that, it's that you can definitely put 20K for 2 kids, Coca-Cola and pizza, and they build a web platform from scratch. But Mexico is far from being Silicon Valley, and most of the innovation we're seeing is actually for more traditional business models where perhaps more money is required to really tackle certain goods or services that are still not there. So I just wanted to know what's your general opinion on the incubator systems, where is this heading to, and how can you actually like push forward for more innovation in traditional sectors in emerging markets?
Well, I'll tell you, the incubator systems that I think have been most successful, impress me, are the ones that are actually connected to universities, where they create space so that those small companies can come and work with a professor that may have research that's quite relevant to what they're trying to develop. I think those types of incubators are often more successful than those that are set up sort of standalone by the government. I'm also a really big fan of trying to connect. You know, one of the revolutions that's occurred in U.S. universities over the last 2 decades is much closer connection to private companies. Some of it came from the Bayh-Dole Act here that made it okay for the university culture to change so that faculty could be encouraged to try to, if they had a good idea and innovation, to actually start a company and have time to do that. And the fact now that many of the most interesting research centers that are universities in the U.S. are interdisciplinary, where they bring faculty from different departments to work together, where they have support not only from government grants and contracts, but also from private companies as well, doing pre-competitive research in areas that are relevant to the country's interests. With incubators, what I found also is most helpful to people trying to start up small companies, to really get good advice on business plans, to be able to interact with experienced people, business people, venture capitalists. I've become a big fan of these open competitions for being able to sort of stimulate innovation, which the government is actually using now for a lot of procurement. One open competition that USAID, the State Department, Nike, and are involved in, we're go at the end of this week to LA, called Launch, L-A-U-N-C-H. It's for innovative technologies that can address problems in low-income countries. And the one that's occurring this week is dealing with managing waste, trying to reduce waste streams or creating productive products out of what is now currently waste, where actually the prize for the best proposals through this open competition from people all over the world, not just the U.S., is not a monetary prize, but it's a prize to get advice from experienced people in business and in venture capital, and perhaps even to acquire some investment. So I think and of course these open competitions have become extremely popular. Perhaps with what USAID and Grand Challenges Canada have done with the Grand Challenges they're sponsoring, dealing with some of the key problems that face developing countries. So I think there are many ways, in addition to sort of standard incubators, to try to help people who are trying to begin a small company and take an innovative idea into the marketplace.
Yeah, vis-a-vis these things, since we're over time, I would encourage you to actually go visit the UNoodle booth, which is on the far end over here, or talk to Rebecca Huang, who I think has a very good encapsulation of my point of view on how that works. So.
We've got 2 minutes left for
No, I think we're over 2 minutes.
for one searing question.
All right.
I'm Dan Driscoll from the University of Texas. I'm working on a startup there called Requip, and we're creating a peer-to-peer marketplace. That's right. So we hear a lot about support with capital, whether it's human capital or financial capital, other kinds of infrastructure support. But the number one thing that matters to a company, and particularly a company that investors are eyeing, is customers. And I was wondering if you could offer some examples, the way that some of these external parties are able to provide support to basically accumulate customers and users.
Well, the whole concept beyond the mega project is that you get a group of customers. So if all the buildings in a given city are built such that the infrastructure is there to put in new green technologies, or the one I talked about earlier about diagnostics and so on, there's sort of a built-in group of customers. You know, we target between 300,000 and several million customers that are available to you. And that's why we believe it's one of the draws for bringing companies in, because they want customers so badly. And it's one of the things governments can help do is define a set of customers, their own citizens, that they're willing to allow this kind of, I don't call it experimentation, but this kind of innovation to be delivered to. So I think that's one of the concepts behind the mega projects. It's certainly not the only way to do it, and there are a lot of other ways of looking at trying to gather customers. But you're right, I mean, that's absolutely the number one thing that people look at now, whether you're in a big company or a small company. So our concept was to try to figure out how you can aggregate enough demand on the customer end to make it a very interesting target for lots of innovations to flow, and particularly to unlock the stasis that a lot of companies are in, where they're unwilling to deploy new technologies or new inventions because they don't see the customer demand.
Well, thank you all. Let's thank Edward for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.